Welcome, guys. Welcome. This is our first ever World Anvil World Building Theme of the Month live stream. So we're super hyped here. We have Guy Sclanders with us today. I'm going to be introducing him properly in a minute. We have Dimitris, and of course, I'm here, the noisy one. And we are going to be going live every week at this time, 8 o'clock on a Sunday, GMT. And we're going to have interviews, we're going to have discussions around tables like we're going to have today, and that's all going to be on the theme of the month. Now, this month, our theme, and that's for the whole of January 2019, is social dynamics in world building. So that's obviously a pretty serious topic. That's pretty wide, and that can mean a lot of things. But today we're going to approach it via social anthropology, specifically relating to kinship, how different people understand relationships, and of course, how those relationships lead to a wider social and cultural grouping within your world. So that's a lot of serious stuff. Let's take a break for a minute and talk to our guest, the incredible Guy Sclanders. Just to introduce him quickly, because he is too modest to say all of this himself. He is originally from South Africa. He is an award-winning tabletop role-playing game GM, and he's also, if he looks familiar, he is the face of the incredible the incredible role-playing channel How to Be a Great GM on YouTube. So if you haven't checked that out yet, absolutely go and check it out. Guy, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. How are you doing, Janet?
I am very good. I'm very hyped and slightly nervous, so we can see what happens. It's pretty early there for you, isn't it?
Yeah, 5 a.m., but that's fantastic. When we're talking role-playing, it doesn't matter what time of day it is. It's always good.
Oh, I love that attitude. And Dimitri, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. I'm trying to get the plague away with a lot of tea. So all good to me.
Okay, more tea for that man. Excellent. So let's dive straight into this, because I have so many things that I want to ask Guy. Social dynamics. What's your first sort of impression of this topic?
That it's a very heavy topic to talk about. Social dynamics is amazing. Yeah, and I think that the other thing with social dynamics, when you look at what does that mean, there's more to it than just what are social dynamics. I think you have to look at it, how is it going to work in your world, and why should you care about it in the first place? So I think that that's important, is to bear that in mind and say, well, there's many anthropologists out there who have written on social dynamics and how big a tribe should be, and when it is no longer a tribe, and there's theories as to scale bringing about certain things. And then when you tie that back to fantasy or to science fiction, you start to realize, well, hang on a moment, there's a lot of space where we have encounters with peoples, with races and things, where this information can actually be quite useful in terms of shaping how those people respond to our heroes, our characters invading their social space, if you like. So lots to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought we could start with the smallest kinship group, because that's a great place to start when you're talking about social dynamic units. So I thought we could start with marriage and extending that to dynasties and how family groups work in different worlds. So have you seen any I have apparently lost the ability to talk. Have you seen any interesting examples of that in fiction or maybe in real life?
I don't think we need to go much further than real life, because it's always stranger than fiction. When you look at marriage specifically, and I just off the top of my head, there are 3 major marriage points, which I think create some very interesting role-playing opportunities. Sure. And the 2 of them are from South Africa, and one of them is from the UK. The UK one, the very first one, is it was misrepresented and all that kind of stuff. But with the marriage rights, there was that horrid law that the English used to use against the Scots, prima nocta, which was the lord was allowed to sleep with the bride just before her wedding day, regardless of whom she was, which I think if you imagine if you have your hero and it's their big day, and the next minute the Lord arrives and says, well, I'm taking your bride-to-be to have my way with her. I think that on alone sets up all kinds of stories.
That's
and it really
very
did
interesting
well.
Story. Yeah, I've never heard about that.
I mean, it was a very strange custom that was brought in to do dominance, really, I think, over the people, to say, well, you have to submit, even in one of the most sort of sacred moments, you have to submit. You couple that with something like what's happened. So you take that extreme where you've got the oppressor kind of forcing their social norms or their social control mechanisms, if you like, on a small population of people. Switch it around, and you go to the Zulu people in South Africa. Their system is polygamous, one chief, many wives. The trick there was that in order, it was a wealth, or is a wealth system rather than anything else. It's not necessarily about true love and that sort of thing. Although it is maintained that the man who's marrying 6 wives or 12 wives loves each of them specially, but just has more room for more love. That's the romantic side of it. The practical side of it is each wife has to be paid for. There's a term called lobola, and lobola is where the husband-to-be pays the bride's family a significant amount of cattle or whatever the currency might be in exchange for the bride.
So like a dowry.
Like a dowry, yes, correct. So if you have lots of wives, it means that you must be exceptionally wealthy, because you've been able to basically not buy, but you've been able to pay for a lot of wives and the like.
Absolutely. And you could also, it's worth mentioning there, sorry to jump in, but it's worth mentioning there that you have enough money to maintain those wives and to feed them and to feed any progeny that might come from them, which means your family is large, so you must be wealthy. Absolutely.
And what was interesting, there was a chief who was either he was Irish or he was from the UK. He moved out to South Africa. He moved into the Zulu culture, if you like. He became a chief, and he had 123 children. To give you a sense of that's
a lot of babies.
That's a lot of loving going on. And it's like, well, that's not tribal. That's making your own dynasty, and that really is making your own dynasty. So you have that, and then on the flip side, there were these German settlers who moved out to South Africa to do forestry. And they were 200 kilometers, so what's about 100 miles from any civilization whatsoever. Usually it was groups of 12 men or so who would go out to establish these logging camps, because there was very good quality yellow wood in South Africa, in that particular stretch of area. And they would write a letter home to Germany saying, we've established our little camp base of 12 men, send wives. And so what the families would do back in Germany would then be to basically go around saying, would anyone like to move to South Africa? It's lovely weather. It's full of dangerous wildlife. It's a million miles from nowhere. There's war all the time, but it's great. It's lovely. You get a nice log cabin, and
you get good.
You get, yes, you get a nice tan. But the women used to do it because they realized that these men were out there and they were putting themselves out to better society, I suppose. So what would happen is 12 women would be selected, put on a ship, sail for 3 months down to South Africa, get off of the ship, be met by one man from the logging camp, who would take them on a specially designed wagon. And the wagon had it was an open-topped 4-wheeled wagon, and the sides were designed to allow the women to sit on the sides of the wagon looking outwards.
Okay.
As the wagon arrives at the logging camp, the 12 loggers would form lines on either side of the wagon track. And as the wagon was wheeled into the logging camp, they'd walk up to the wagon and they'd pick a wife off of the seat. And that was the entirety of the marriage ceremony. You were now married for life. And you go, well, you
And people say we don't need feminism.
I will have to say, though, German efficiency on its prime, right? Like,
oh, absolutely. And I think what makes that story a little bit more romantic is that those families that were established, this was the 1860s, 1870s, those families are still in that region, and the lineage is still there from those original unions. But divorce was not an option, because if you got divorced, you had a 100-mile walk through extremely dangerous territory back to the nearest town. So anyway, so those are three, I thought, very different looks at the marriage space from a social perspective. And if you apply those to your narratives in any shape or form, it creates these moments of, really, is that it? I have one more for you if you like. It's one that I found.
Treat us.
This was one that came from the Amazon, and it was particularly used in small tribes where the tribe wanted to avoid jealousy. But because they're so insular, so isolated from anybody else, the only way that you would meet another tribe would be by accident. There were no giant moots of all of the Amazon tribes coming, as one might sort of think, or as has been posited in films and things.
Hope for the gene pool.
Right. So what they would do to avoid jealousy was, at the end of every year, your marriage contract basically was zeroed. All the women gathered in the center of the village, and all of the men had to choose a new wife. So you cycled out. So if this year you didn't get the one that you wanted, you could just wait until next year, and hopefully you'd then get the wife that you wanted, but you only had her for a year. And I think the reverse was true as well. If you didn't get the husband you wanted, well, you only had to stick it out for a year, and then you could sort of swap out and try and get somebody else. So, and that idea is, I think, to our modern sensibilities, you go, well, that's interesting. But imagine now if you have that and you apply that to elves, and it's not every year, but it's every 100 years. The elves now say, well, we've been together for 100 years. We know each other. We've had enough time. So now we sort of get together and we cycle out, and we've married somebody else, and if you have that sort of ceremony in the background, or it's something that's taking place, I think that could be quite an interesting add to your world. And it's literally just by looking at the different ceremonies across the planet that we as humans do.
Ceremonies,
absolutely.
in general, signify something much bigger than just a ceremony. Ceremonies are effectively what happens after years or centuries of cultural growth in a society, and they signify effectively what this culture puts weight on and importance to. And I think that is something that, it cannot be overstated enough. Like, if you are in a harsh environment, you normally think that ceremony will be much simpler, but in fact, it becomes sometimes so important that it becomes much more complex and much more intricate, effectively, because they need to signify the importance of what is happening at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're... Sorry, Guy, go ahead.
I was going to say that if you look at modern day Western thinking, that whole idea of the two-income family, or at least the one-income family, and the wife being at home doing all of the cooking and cleaning and raising the children, all that sort of thing, that you could argue was necessary a long time ago, just from a safety perspective and that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't matter who stays at home. That I don't think makes a difference. But nowadays you look and you go, well, you can be on your own and survive and live a happy life and raise happy children. So you don't need those rigid social pressures anymore. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at how these dynamics work. Here in Japan, the dynamic works very differently, which I won't necessarily go into, but and it's because of cultural pressure keeping it that way rather than what individuals want.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of interesting things to be considered as well in terms of like who is allowed to have children, who is supposed to have children, and who is not allowed to have children. Because of course today we think that having children is a right, and a basic human right, and that's fine. But that is not true in all societies, and that is not true all the way throughout history. So that can also be a big source of conflict in your world if you have a character who desperately wants to have a child and is not allowed to, or a character who has to have a child and does not want to, which is actually still an issue today for a lot of people, again, because of social pressure and all sorts of other things, that's definitely something that you can put into your world building. It's a very easy thing at its concept, but it's something that will bleed out very widely throughout all of your social dynamic structures, essentially.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, when you look at children as a component, if you examine elves, and I mean, I go back to elves because traditionally elves are long-lived creatures. I don't know offhand of any literature where elves are not long-lived. Terry Pratchett's elves live forever in their little elvish dimension. Tolkien's elves live until they take a boat ride somewhere. Generally speaking, elves live for a long time.
Sure, it's in the blueprint.
It's in the blueprint, yeah. Unless you change that, which is absolutely fine, but then you need to establish it up front. So with elves, where the age of maturity is 115 years, give or take. Now, this is sort of working off Dungeons and Dragons. You go, well, then does that mean that the reproductive cycle is only every 100 years or so? Because traditionally, that's what happens. You have these cycles of reproduction, and when we look at tribes, again, I go back to South Africa, and we have the Khoisan, who are a semi-nomadic now, but they're a hunter-gatherer tribe of people who were relatively untouched by modern civilization. And there, the women, the men have no choice. They can't give birth. I mean, it's tragic, but they can't. So anyway, so the women can give birth, but the shape of their bodies is slightly different because, and their cycles are different as well. They can only really give birth every 2 years. And that's just enough time span for the first child to be able to walk.
And be weaned, yeah. And
be weaned so that then the second one can come into play. But also the shape of their hips has changed slightly as well. It's a wider hip, and in sort of the Victorian era, it was seen as a strange curiosity where you had these women who had very large hips, very heart-shaped hips, as opposed to the European women at the time who were wearing whalebone corsets to try and achieve the same sort of thing. And the reason for it is because you can quite literally hold a child on those hips a lot easier when you are walking significant distances every single day.
Sure.
So children have a huge impact on your evolution. And going back to the elves, if an elvish woman only has to reproduce once every 100 years, what does that mean in terms of the cultural norm? Again, does it become this amazing ceremony? And for that, I think one of the greatest long-running explorations of that in social history are the Vulcans from Star Trek.
I was hoping you were going to talk about Dunbar.
7 years.
Had to happen. Yeah, exactly.
It does. Yeah. And so you look at how they handle Ponfar as this incredibly personal thing, and they don't want to share it with other Vulcans because it's so extreme that if you don't know what Ponfar is, and if you're not a big Trekkie fan, like clearly we are, yeah, what it means is that the Vulcans only ever mate once every 7 years. Traditionally, they're supposed to mate with their spouse, whom they only have one of, and they basically get together for as long as logically
monogamous.
Very serious process. But if they don't mate, if they don't manage to get to their partner and have that intimate connection, park that thought, just put a pin in there. We're going to come back to something about intimate connections. But if they don't, they become these wild, savage animals that only bloodlust and the killing of something is able to release that.
Yeah.
And so the show, throughout all of its iterations in perpetuity, has always dealt with how do these people deal with that. Now, what's interesting about Star Trek is that it really is a tribal show. It's about a group of 12. Sure, in the background, there's 300, 600 extras NPCs that are supposed to be there, but they really are bland NPCs. They're very seldom developed. It's the core little group of 12 officers or 10 officers that we look at. So it's a classic example of how you take these social dynamics, you turn them on their head and you say, well, what if you can only have sex once every 7 years? Or what if you have to have 3 wives and each wife has their own husband plus your husband? Because that's also something that Star Trek looked at with Dr. Phlox, was these more complicated models which could theoretically exist, and which we're starting to see, with polyamory and that sort of thing in today's society becoming more of a thing. We're seeing how we as humans are also trying out different combos of tribe building, if you like. So I think it's quite interesting to see that. So coming back to that pin, what I like is when you are creating a world, when you're creating an environment and you're bringing in rituals and you're bringing in traditions and things. With the Vulcans, for example, there are many things that the Vulcans do. There's the live long and prosper symbol, which, as everybody knows, was invented by Nimoy because he needed a way to say goodbye to Kirk in one of the episodes. And so he sort of just did that because other people couldn't do it. So it was a bit of a jibe at them. Sure. But they took it further. So in the film, The Search for Spock is going through the Pon farr in a much shorter time frame because of science or Star Trek magic, if you like.
Handwavium.
And exactly right. And what they did was they came up with a calming ritual that was used during the Pon farr, which then was used for the rest of the series. And it was I thought it was a beautiful little moment in the film because it felt so human. It felt so real. And that was the actors. I've got horrid fingers, but the actors would sort of stroke their fingers up and down and around and on their ears, making use of Vulcan physiology and the like. But by adding that ritual in, it made it feel as if it was something that was real, that existed, and wasn't just lip service. Oh, here's a cultural thing, sex every 7 years, and then that's it. It was developed, was fleshed out with a few little details, not tomes and tomes and tomes of stuff, just enough to give us a sense that it was real, a sense that these things were happening in the background and that they were part of a bigger culture. I really appreciate it.
I think that's something that you touch a lot, Guy, as well in your videos when it comes to how far you should expand in these kind of things. And as you are saying for your campaign videos, it's better to, when you create a culture or you create essentially a tradition, touch on the things that people will see more about this culture, and you don't have to expand and write everything about it. Like live long and prosper, Pon farr, definitely the idea of as a species they used to be aggressive and now they're trying to become more essentially intelligent and more serene as people. This is enough to effectively give a broad brushstroke essentially on a culture that you can expand if you need to, and if people want to essentially play the character or anything like that, I'm guessing.
Completely correct. Don't give too little, because then it's not enough to pique someone's interest. Just give just enough, and that's always the art. Is just how much do you give for people to go, oh, that's interesting, I want to know more. And that's where you want your audience. You want your audience to always be saying, I want to know more, rather than, oh God, would you please stop? I freely admit it. Tolkien was a great author, and Lord of the Rings, of course, and The Hobbit has completely changed how we look at fiction. But he did overdo it on the songs. I have never read all of the songs in the Lord of the Rings back to back. It's like, yes, okay, it's a song, fine, moving on, 12 pages later, oh God, it's another song.
I love the comment that somebody he has given us at some point in Gold Anvil that was actually Tolkien needed the Gold Anvil, so his books would be more about the story and less about the world building.
Yes,
right.
I have to say, I refer to Tolkien as patient zero of world builder's disease in my YouTube videos. He absolutely is, and I have some very uncomplimentary things to say about Tom Bombadil's singing. Just drives me berserk. And actually, one of the things I wanted to say, which is sort of related to that, is that when you are deciding these cultural quirks, whatever they might be, it's worth taking a minute to consider how you're going to show them so you don't have to tell them. And that goes back to show, don't tell. You don't want to give somebody an article which is like the cultural anthropologist's guide to your snorks or your smells or whatever you've created. What you want to do is come up with a couple of really like concise tells, which will, or rather concise shows, if I'm going to go with my own terminology, which will give your players or your readers or whoever is using your world a hint of that they can then explore, rather than shoving in a primer in their face, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something not to labor the point, but when you're saying show, don't tell, it's use one of the 5 senses, don't tell.
Exactly.
Whether it's sagebrush that gets burnt in front of the bridal groom, or is it rose petals? Is it bits of rice that are thrown rather than bits of polystyrene for environmental reasons as confetti? Whatever it is, if you engage one of the senses, it makes, and you engage it for some kind of bizarre reason. And when you look at traditions, I mean, that's a whole different video altogether, just to see where those came up from. You're like, well, some of these things just don't make any sense at all. At all. So
yeah, absolutely. There's one other thing I want to touch on, and I realize we have been talking about marriage and dynasties for quite a while already, and that is that depending on the life length and the childhood length of your species, that's going to affect the parent-child relationship. Because a child that grows up in 2.5 years, like goblin kids, for example, I don't know, but I would imagine, they are going to have less of a maternal or paternal bond than a child who's been in the care of their parents for 125 years, as elves are.
I can see that 125 years being a very long time if you have a difficult elf teenager. I having grown up with my sister, that was 5 years of trauma. 100 years, I think, by the end. I'm surprised that elves aren't actually all psychotic, cannibalistic marauders of death.
To be fair, Terry Pratchett, elves are.
Yes, they are. He
may be onto something.
Maybe he may be onto something. But I mean, that's why everyone loves Terry Pratchett. I mean, he was brilliant from that perspective of making commentary on social stuff. And if you look at goblins, you take it a step further and you say, well, mum and dad are probably all fighting. Or at least dad is. There's a sense Magic the Gathering had the goblin matriarch and the goblin matron, who were women who were assigned specifically to look after the goblin kids, whilst everyone else was out and about doing goblin-esque type of things.
But we've seen that as well. Like, we've seen these change happening during the Second World War. Like, this is the reason that we see people that are like the suffragettes coming up, because if the men are at war, somebody has to have, things happen and run the country, essentially, and that is the women. And it is as simple as that, yeah.
Correct. I mean, the 1912 movement, and it wouldn't necessarily have gone very far if there wasn't, as you say, World War I, which said, well, there's no one to work the factories, so women, you have to step up and do that. There was another thing to think about with regards to children anyway, is that there are some species that lay eggs. How do they look after their young? Do they look after their young? Do they just lay the egg and then they leave? And there's so many different natural ways of looking after one's children. When I say natural ways, I mean, you have the seahorse, where it's the male who tends the children. They get born, the seahorse male looks after them. There's others where the eggs are laid and they just left to their own devices. And that you look at the implications thereof of social creatures that have been taken out of their space as well. And the imprint that they have, it does make some interesting decisions from you as the world builder. If we often talk about, dragon eggs get stolen away, but dragons are intelligent creatures and they're social creatures, generally speaking. Do they imprint and take on human characteristics, which would be interesting, or do they maintain that sort of draconian sense? Is there a longing for that? And we have seen that played out many times in fantasy and science fiction, where the individual has been removed from their space, raised by others, and then there's a longing to go back to try and find their origins, and then there's either a joyous reunion, or they realize that it's so culturally different to what they expected it to be that it's actually not for them, and they go back to their family.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you can pick any aspect of the nuclear unit unpack it and look at it and go, well, that's interesting. That makes more sense. I mean, the Spartan approach to raising children, men, boys were taken off and looked after by men, girls were looked after by women, and it wasn't necessarily the parents who were responsible for it. Different way of looking at it completely.
Sure, no, absolutely. And as you say, there's so much in there that you can unpack and that you can start to try to vary in your world, and then consider the impact of that, how that's going to bleed out onto other things, and how that's going to bleed out into society in a wider sense. So let's move beyond the family unit and talk about what is technically called fictive kin. So this is like blood brothers, godparents, these kinds of relationships where you're not a blood relation, but there is a formal relationship between you, and you are in a way family.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the blood brother approach is more something that we can use in fantasy and in fiction than perhaps godparents.
Yeah.
And the only reason for it is that if you look at the origin of godparents, the idea that, well, if mummy and daddy die, these people are going to look after you. Why mummy and daddy like to die? Well, because it's, when the institution came into being, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was somewhere around the 17 or the 1600s when you had plague going on. So you had all these orphans running around. Well, hang on a moment. Let's bring in this concept that there are these divinely appointed alternatives should the main leave. You look at it and you go, yes, okay, that's one way that the society dealt with orphans and the like. Again, I go back to looking at South Africa, and in South Africa during the 90s, and as we called them, but apparently this didn't go very far around the world, we called them the noughties, which was 2000 to 2010. That was
an unfortunate phase in England as well, yes.
Right. Okay. So there we go. So anyway, during that period, HIV was ravaging the country. And so your parents, the parents of children, often just died en masse. So what happened was you had these kids who were 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, who had no parents. And so siblings had to step in, or the community had to step in to help raise these kids. And that's a bond mechanism as well, is how does that now affect those children? How does it affect them in terms of their own family structures and things? I look here in Japan at how their approach to raising children works and the issues that come out of that. So when you then look at something like blood brothers, or I don't want to say conflict-induced things, because blood brothers often is not necessarily that. It's just you've been with this person for a very long time and you've got a very close bond.
But also battle brothers and that kind of thing.
Battle brothers, correct. Sort of experiential brothers, survivor guilt, where all the survivors have got this bond. It is something to explore, and I think it's more interesting to explore as the player in a game, or as the main character in the game, where they are unpacking these things and trying to figure out who do they support and who don't they support, and then the betrayal that happens around that. And I think one of the classics of that is Captain America and Bucky. Who they are effectively blood brothers, I suppose. And then there's the brainwashing and all that kind of stuff. And Winter Soldier comes in, and then it sort of switches around. So that's an example of taking that and then running it as a thread in amongst everything else that's going on. I think that's the important thing, is that you can explore these kinds of social dynamic relationships. You can explore them as a central theme, or you can have them as a secondary theme, sort of running in the background, supporting or guiding or punctuating moments within your main story, I think.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned something very important there, which is that social dynamics as a whole, and our relationship to others, and again, your character's relationship to others, is a great way to leverage conflict. Because And again, either as part of a main theme or as part of a side theme, it's a great way to create conflict. It's a great way to spur on your characters. And I know that you yourself have mentioned the fact that when you create NPCs, it's very important to create NPCs that your characters really love, they're really likable, because then when you kill them off, it has a massive impact. And again, that's where these kinds of social relationships come from.
It is interesting because we have, in fact, two types of kin. We have the kin which is enforced upon you, like, for example, a godfather or a godmother, or, for example, your stepfather. And you have the kin who you choose to be bonded with. And there are two different, really important dynamics, in fact, for role building and in general in life. And we see it like from the medieval times, you would see that in different countries and in different cultures, the whole idea of the king was quite important because it affected also lineage. And you see in many royal families, for example, that there is a separation between who is kin and who is blood and who is, in fact, family. But we see also that in so many cases, because these bonds can become really strong and can become really important, that you see people who are kin, like, for example, bastards, which are legitimized, or friends or battle brothers, which in fact become members of the family, almost like becoming adopted by the family. And you see them coming into the tree and growing from the same family tree. And this is how you create essentially the superstructures of large families like the Habsburgs, or, for example, like the Tudors, and major families which grew and they have royalty upon royalty coming out of them effectively, and especially in Germany, for example.
Absolutely. It's also worth mentioning that the relationships that we don't consider to be family often are considered family in other cultures. So a great example of this actually is in Greek culture is the kumbaros. Am I saying that right, Dimitri?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So the kumbaros is the couple that is like the best man and the best woman, the maid of honor, I suppose, at your wedding. But they are then bonded to you, and they have a responsibility to teach you how to be a good couple, to teach you how to be nice to each other, to teach you how to succeed as a couple. And they are then also the godparents of your children. And it is a formal social bond. It means something very, very specific. Another great example of the fact is that, so I am British American and Dimitri is Greek, and we got married. And so I have a set of Greek in-laws and Dimitri has a set of British American in-laws. That's really easy. By Greek law, our in-laws are now related to each other. By English law, they are not. And so these are also interesting things to explore when you're doing your world building. What kind of relationships can you formalize or deformalize? And how do codes of honor, both legal codes of honor and social codes of honor, extend to different members of the family to different degrees? So are your fifth cousins bound to you by honor as your first cousins are, for example? This is all really, it's world building gold, because this defines how big the social unit is. This defines how extended your code of honor needs to extend. So if somebody kills your fifth cousin, do you have to exact vengeance? Are you allowed to exact vengeance? Or is it something that you're not related to at all?
Right. I think the other question is, do you even have such a thing as fifth cousins?
Right.
I think that's something that I think it's all over the West. I stand to be corrected, but you can have your fifth cousin once removed, twice removed, thrice removed, and you go, well, hang on, how does that work? Well, if you trace the tree all the way back and then you branch out and you come down and then you go further out, that's how you get twice removed third cousins.
Right. But you know who lives a really long time? The elves. You know, right. Who really has to be really good at heraldry? The elves. Absolutely
correct. But any long-lived species needs to do that, and with that goes along the lines of inheritance, and we know that is a major issue as well. Sometimes women just can't inherit. So it doesn't matter how closely related you are. Absolutely. Sorry, it goes to the first son or the second son or the third son or the seventh son of the seventh son, is, always a sorcerer. Each of these topics could be a whole topic on its own in terms of exploring and deciding and discovering. And I think that when you look at science fiction as a genre, oftentimes they will choose one aspect and then really explore that. If you look at something like Sliders or Stargate or Star Trek, for example, they go, okay, let's look at a society where everyone is related to everybody else, and so when you attack one person, you're attacking the entire society. How does that work? How does that sort of survive? And that's where you when you're talking that sort of scale, you're looking at, well, that's what an ant or a bee colony is. You're not attacking just one ant, you're attacking every ant. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. We are getting to a point where we need to start taking some questions. So before we do that, Guy, any final thoughts on this topic?
The fact that we didn't get through all the rest of the topic.
Did not. There is so much to talk about with this. I prepared Guy a lovely document with all sorts of aspects that we could talk about. Like we were going to go on to talk about social groups and clubs and societies and how you can use them in books. Let's have a quick word on that, Guy. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. Look, I mean, societies, social classes, castes, and all those kinds of things. Oh, yeah. They are furtherings of societal control. Oftentimes, that's where it stems from. Is how do we control beyond our group? There was an anthropologist who came up with a thing called Dunbar's number, which is the size of you as an individual. How many people can you have that you're intimate with versus how many people that you kind of know about versus how many people you have in your circles. And those numbers oftentimes, because there are a whole lot of books that you can read. And if you're really, really keen on looking at anthropology and how a lot of these things came out, there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which is a seminal work in terms of anthropological shifting and moving over the world and where sort of things came from and why certain cultures seem to dominate and others didn't, and looking at sort of cultural things. But you know, they talk about, well, your good number is somewhere between 20 and 30, or your sort of close group, or and 100 is your broader group, and 300 is your biggest group. I don't know if that's completely true anymore because of things like social media, where you have much bigger reach to connect with people and to form pretty good bonds with them. Anyway, so they talk about these numbers, but effectively, when you start to have giant groups of people that are no longer vestedly interested in each other, that's just my neighbor over there, I don't care if they live or die, you then have to start bringing in cultural requirements that the social contract. Sure. I can't just go and rape my neighbor's wife because I don't know them. I can't do that. I have to actually go through the formal, whatever. So that's where it starts to get very interesting, is what are the rules that started to come into being to keep those societies functioning and then ultimately trap those societies in the space that they're in, and that require major upheaval in order to change. And that's a whole different kettle of fish altogether.
Absolutely. And that's one of the hallmarks of something like fish out of water fantasy or portal fantasy, which is that you have somebody who goes into a social situation where all the social rules are different, and then they have to negotiate that. And of course, it's a very nice way for the learning curve for the reader or for the player as well to learn through the eyes of this fish out of water how things operate, how things function.
Right.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about social. Oh, excuse me.
I'll have a moment.
I beg your pardon.
A cup of tea.
Yes, we have been a plague house this week. Dimitri and I are both getting over a cold, so apologies for the coughing and bronchial sounds on this end. But so I want to take a moment to talk about social strata. That is castes and classes. First of all, of course, these are very different, the one from the other. Caste is much more about sort of social pigeonholing and much more tied to profession and is much more rigid, whereas class or social status is much more tied to birth and wealth. And you can climb through a class, but you can't climb through a caste. So have you seen interesting models of these, either in fiction or in real life?
Yeah, well, fiction obviously is replete with these different things, and usually when I'm reading, whatever I happen to be reading at the time, I'm usually reading a fiction book and a non-fiction book at the same time. So I can kind of go, do I want to forget about my worldly problems and read the fantasy, or do I want to learn about history because or whatever it is that I'm studying at the time? And the caste system, when you look at the caste system of India, which is a very easily accessible caste system because it was very rigid, it was very entrenched, and is still there to a large degree. There's a lot of remnant caste system in place. But what was interesting was when the social experiment was applied to it, where you took the caste away, what happened? Sure. And once again, I think it's a testament to how complicated South Africa is as a country. But that's where that happened. Was in the 1870s, British Empire was bringing people from India, bringing the caste-based people to South Africa to work on farms and the like. But when they arrived in South Africa, the caste was destroyed. Literally, sure. As they stepped off of the ship, the caste system was gone because there was no one from the Indian culture to be present in South Africa to guard it. So people were stepping off of the boat and realizing, oh, we can abandon our caste. We no longer need to be put into these pigeonholes, as you say. We can do what we want. So they changed their space. They moved themselves into the mercantile band, if you like. So when you look at the surnames, which often help dictate where you sat in the caste structure, the surnames are almost invariably a Mudley, a Reddy, a Naidu, or a Singh, or a Governor. And when you look at the phone book of South Africa, those are the names that are associated with that population. I mean, South Africa's got a significant population. It's the biggest Indian population outside of India. But they abandoned their caste system. And as a result, in between 1875 and 1900, which is when they were sort of bringing all of these migrants across, that population had the highest suicide rate ever recorded because everything was destroyed. There was no caste system. There was no religious sort of practices that were really allowed. There weren't a lot of women or children that were brought over because of a whole bunch of reasons. It was take a world, rip it away, and see what's left. And people just lost their way. They were in excruciatingly bad circumstances, and then they had nothing to hold on to. So very interesting to see what happens when the caste system gets taken away.
Which explains also why when in India the caste system was kind of abandoned, in fact, people continued following it, and they still do in many locations in India.
Yes.
Because
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it is so ingrained into the culture and so important for them that gives them meaning and gives essentially for many people the reason to be who they are.
Correct. And a lot of the times you go, the caste system is there because sometimes as an outsider you go, well, that's a silly system. I mean, that's just daft that you can't do what you want to do based on your surname or based on your skin color or based on your hair color, or as Gattaca, that film with Ethan Hawke, looked at based on your DNA, you couldn't do certain things because you weren't likely to be qualified. So there's an example of science fiction exploring the caste system at a level that as humans we might very well get to. Looking at a system from the outside, often one has contempt for it because you haven't been part of it. But if you have been part of it, to lose it is sometimes like losing a limb. You just don't know how to operate without it. You haven't sort of adjusted to it. Interestingly enough, the new sci-fi series Orville, which is I enjoy Orville for a whole lot of reasons. I'm not going to go. Anyway, Orville did a show where they arrived on this planet where people could vote you. You could be upvoted or downvoted, liked or disliked. And if you were disliked, you were eventually basically executed. If enough people thought that you were a bad person, you were simply executed. If enough people thought that you were a good person, you were elevated up through the ranks, and your caste system was based on how many people liked you or not. And if you look at social media, oftentimes we go, well, oh, my post got 10,000 likes. I must be an influencer, or I must be a this, or I must be a that. And you go, well, where are we heading with that? When you go to a Twitch convention, it's like, oh, those are the big Twitchers because they've got thousands, so they have this perceived elevated status. They're exactly the same as a person who has less views, less likes. They just happen to be more popular. Anyway, so caste systems, I think, are always going to be there because we like, as a species, to differentiate.
As a species, we're also very well ingrained into the idea of hierarchies. I mean, we came from a system of hierarchy. There is a leader, no matter what this leader is, male or female, it doesn't really matter, but we tend, even if we're left all alone, to create those structures. And we have many movies that in fact explore the idea, what happens if you leave 50 children in an island, what's going to happen? And the sociological studies that have happened in any occasions, like the experiment in Germany or any other interesting experiments we've done in sociological structures like that, always show hierarchy will evolve and will be created even if nothing was there to begin with.
Yeah, you're muted, Janet.
I beg your pardon. Thank you. It's worth mentioning that while societies often fall into hierarchy, we also, as creators, hierarchy and these kinds of systems are a very convenient way to organize social structures, and also a very convenient way to convey our social structures. So even if they're not as rigid in our world as we describe them to be, it's a very easy way of conveying that kind of information, and it's very attractive to creators. And that's one of the reasons I think that you see it so much in world building and so much in fiction of all kinds. I would like to mention briefly that there is a sensitivity issue involved in things like castes and classes, that these are real life problems that people still struggle with today, as you mentioned with the Indian caste system, for example, and that you never know who is going to be reading your work. You never know who is going to be playing at your table. So it's very good to be very sensitive with this kind of thing as well. That's just the final thing I want to say about that.
I think, the safest approach, if you want to call it safe, I think it's also the more decent approach personally, is that when I look at cultures from across the world for inspiration, it's never with this is what a silly idea. It's always a case of, that's an interesting idea. Let's see why they do that. Okay, that's why they do that. That's interesting. How can I incorporate it into my space? So if you go in with an open mind, looking for the curiosities, looking for the reasons behind why these things exist, I think you have less prejudice than going, oh, well, it's just a silly old-fashioned idea. No, it's an idea that, as you say, is still viable, it's still valuable, it's still personally invested by a lot of people. So rather just say, that's interesting. How can I take that? How can I unpack that? How can I incorporate that? I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I actually have no personal involvement. I'm using it to create a space and being respectful of it as well.
Fantastic. Now, we do need to stop for some questions, and we've got some great ones. I don't think we'll be able to cover all of them, but I will be doing questions in week 4 of January as well. So that's, again, Sunday, 8 o'clock GMT. I'll be running a stream specifically for questions, so keep them coming in. Let's start with the bourgeoisie punk, who asks, what are your thoughts on planned societies like Divergence or the Maze Runner, etc., where new cultures are created or formed intentionally by small groups of people instead of developed over time?
Well, I think they're more a function of necessity than anything else. And when you look at Divergent is a wonderful example. It's very similar to Harry Potter. You have your houses, your clans, call them what you will. Online gaming, when I used to do it, when we used to game using pigeons, it was a lot of fun because you belonged to a clan and you had your clan tags, which were very prevalent. They are still prevalent to this day, where you have these sort of things happening. So I'm not sure exactly what the question was, though, with that. Did I miss it?
No. So what do you think about them, basically?
What do I think about them? I think they're marvelous. I think that when you introduce anything into your world, or worlds, whatever the case might be, introducing the clan idea, in the case of the Maze Runner, it was to show that there is an alternative. So it was being used as a tool to say, all right, here's a band of people, they've got together, this is what they're doing, this is what's going to move them forward. When you look at Divergent and Convergent and Exvergent, whatever the last one was, it was about saying, okay, so you've got these different castes, you've got these different clans, as you say, and then of course you've got the people who transcend those. And in Divergent, I mean, the interesting thing was that the family members went to different houses, and I quite like that because it set up some interesting options in terms of would they work against each other, would they work with each other. Dune is another classic example of different houses. So it's something that's definitely used. And I think there's so much to explore, especially in the small units. Lord of the Flies, Golding's work, is a good example of clans forming in an isolated system and the different styles that result in conflict. So.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the important things to consider this is if it's manufactured or if it's left to develop by itself. That's an important concept. I think the stresses on society and the stresses on the society that you're dealing with are also an important concept. So what are the conflict points? Are they in a safe location? Are they in a dangerous location? That's going to affect how the groups form, but based on the priorities of surviving in the culture that exists.
I think, in fact, that in terms of constructed or planned societies, something very interesting to explore always is why they came to be. I mean, when you have to essentially reboot a society, something quite tragic happened and some decisions were made because of specific reasons. Like, you don't say, okay, let's recreate the world and let's do it like that because, I woke up one day and it was like that. There must have been reasons. For Divergence is a very good example. For example, why separating these houses? Why separating these castes? Why the structures are different? Why do we need different people essentially in different locations? And also in Divergent, we also saw the fact, as Guy said very well, is that they separated families, which essentially means that they almost on purpose wanted to destroy that very fundamental construct of the family, which is needed effectively in terms of growing kids and making them more important to go into their divergent classes and divergent essentially roles effectively.
Right. And when you look at that, if you try and unpack why would you try and break up the family unit? Because I think globally the mentality is your family unit is very important, and people lament the fact that families are no longer these traditional models. If you look at what happens when you take away the family and you raise the children in an institution or in a clan-based space, what you're effectively doing is you're removing individuality, because the family unit might say you must wear a dress of this length when you go out clubbing or however it might be. You have a free space to rebel and sneak out the window wearing a long dress, and the punishment, it might be slightly severe, but it's family. So it's still going to be couched with that, within that space, hopefully, of love. Once you're in an institution, however, and you are just a number, that individuality gets suppressed heavily because you just can't. You buck the system, you get put in isolation, you get re-educated, and you get shipped back out again. So it creates some interesting spaces when you try and take these things apart and look at what they could possibly influence the individual with.
Absolutely. Well, we have had quite a talk there. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions now. As I say, we will look at those in week 4. So make sure you tune in week 4 to get your questions answered. I would like to thank Guy, who has been just a fount of inspiration today. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Sorry. Dimitri, you were saying something.
I was just saying thank you as well. It was amazing. Really.
It's been such a pleasure. And wow, all I can say is that South Africa seems like such a rich cultural place.
It really is. I mean, there's so many different cultures that came together and that are still there and evolving and changing and learning how to work together. So it does give you a very interesting look into a very big world problems in a very small space.
Absolutely. Well, that is all from us today.
Before we go, Janet,
yes,
I would like to let the people know that we will be making a podcast out of this, and there will be an AMA as well. So your questions are not lost. We'll keep them, all of them, and we will make announcements for the next streams. And Janet will be going through the questions with you, and we might have Guy to see him again soon enough. I'm pretty sure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you'll have me back, I know I tend to talk too much. So
there is no such thing. All right. Well, if you want more tips from Guy, if you want more information and more inspiration, make sure you check out his YouTube channel, which is going to get posted in the chat right now. Or if you are a GM or a budding GM and you want to learn about how to create epic campaigns, then you need to check out his book, The Complete Guide to Epic Campaigns. I have to say, I did some of the editing on this book. It is astonishingly good. It is such a good read. And I am not a GM. I am a writer. And I found it incredibly inspiring for writing and for creating scenarios for that as well. So really, there is something for everyone in there. If you're a world builder, if you like creating settings and you like creating plots, that is the book for you. Go check it out. You can get the hard copy or you can find it on DriveThruRPG. And the links for that should be coming into the chat as well. Just before we go, we'd like to give a quick shout out to Maze Arcana, which is a live action D&D collective. They really are astonishing, and we're sponsoring them right now. So we're extra excited about them. They really are fantastic. So if you like live action D&D, you check them out. They have 3 different shows. They are all wonderful and all unique. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It has been such a pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you so much for your questions, which have been really, really interesting and informative. So with that, all we have to say is grab your hammer and go World Build!